A lot of people tend to think that the segregated South is a timeless phenomenon rather than the result of particular historical circumstances. And like with my book, that I look before that period of time, before the Jim Crow segregated South was institutionalized, to take a look at relationships between blacks and whites of a particular economic category, slaves and poor whites. And if you look at that period of time before the Civil War, blacks and whites were not segregated. It could not have been otherwise. Slaves were a captive workforce, and you had to have racial interaction between black and white. So that's one of the larger misconceptions about race relations in the South, is that there's always been segregation, when in fact there is not. A lot of your earlier scholarship on slaves and poor whites maintained that their relationships were most notable for their racial hostility, the animosity between the two distinct groups. And while that is true, it's also only part of the story. That if you take a look at court records and slave narratives, you can find another whole range of relationships as well. That slaves and poor whites inhabited a shared subculture of drinking and gambling and underground trade, illicit sex. That's another part of the story that people are less acquainted with. Poor whites most commonly traded for food that slaves could either grow and sell to them, or steal from their master and sell to them. Slaves most frequently traded for alcohol, which of course they could not legally purchase. But any number of articles might be traded between slaves and poor whites, and clothing, for instance, but pretty much anything. There's a small suggestion that slaves and poor whites could sympathize with one another. There are poor whites, for instance, who do help slaves run away and escape from bondage. But at the same time, a lot of, say, for instance, the trade that takes place between them is motivated by the mutual benefits that accrue to each group. They did not have to sympathize with one another to engage in a business relationship. They did not have to feel sympathy toward one another to engage in a sexual relationship. That might be the case for a small handful, but not necessarily.
Did this relationship change after the slaves were freed?
Certainly, yes. Things very definitely do change, because now, slaves have been liberated. They are now freed people, and that in and of itself is a challenge to the way things had always been, and they become much more threatening. This is why suddenly sexual relationships between freed men and poor white women suddenly become problematic in the post-Civil War South. Prior to the Civil War, those relationships did happen, and oftentimes communities would tolerate them. Not always, and there were, of course, poor white women who would levy rape charges against slaves, but there was no predetermined outcome when those cases went to trial. In one particular case, one of the favorite ones that I uncovered, there was a woman by the name of Rachel Holman who lived in Anderson District, South Carolina. And this was in the 1850s. She was walking through the woods. She was carrying a basket of tomatoes with her when she was accosted by a slave man by the name of Lewis. And Lewis attempted to rape her. Rachel Holman did everything right. She reported the rape immediately. You could tell that she was disheveled. Her dress was stained by the tomatoes. And it seemed like, well, gee, maybe Lewis will wind up being executed for this crime. But at the actual trial, the trial was really all about Rachel and whether or not she, as a poor white woman, merited that kind of justice. The trial became a big investigation of her character as a white woman. Does her character suggest that she could have been raped? And through the calling of all of these witnesses at the trial, Rachel Holman does not come across very well. It turns out we learn her entire sexual history. We learn that she slept with 4 or 5 different white men. We learn that she had been seen holding hands with a black boy, and she's maybe 20 years old at this time. That her work routines, the labor that she did, she was so poor, she hired out to work for a free black man to pick his cotton. This is a very unusual kind of thing. It's not the kind of thing we don't normally think of. But then that night, she stayed at his house. Her mother kept a disorderly house, as they called it, where they entertained travelers. Rachel took in laundry, and there would be, black men coming to pick up their socks in the middle of the night. All of this suggested to them that Rachel was essentially a prostitute. Whether or not she actually sold sexual favors for money, we don't know. But the public opinion was that indeed she was. So Lewis was found not guilty of this attempted rape. My research focused primarily on North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. And what I'm finding there is, pretty consistent to the extent that there are differences in the degree of contact. A lot of it simply has to do with the demographics of a particular region. If you're looking at, say, the low country of South Carolina, that's a majority black population, fewer poor whites, so naturally there'd be somewhat less contact there. At the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're looking at the mountainous regions of western North Carolina or eastern Tennessee, relatively few slaves in those regions, plenty of poor whites. So really, I'm finding the best evidence of these kinds of relationships in that meeting point between in the Piedmont region of North Carolina, in the middle and upcountry of South Carolina. This is where I found the best evidence of these kinds of interactions. I look primarily at court records. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with poor whites, that's about the best set of records you can come up with because the vast majority of them are illiterate. They're not leaving diaries, they're not leaving journals, they're not leaving farm account books because they don't own their farms. They farm somebody else's land or they work as a hired laborer. So they oftentimes only show up in court records. So that becomes my primary source, along with petitions to governors, slave narratives. Ironically, it's actually easier to learn about slaves than it is to learn about poor whites. Because you do have like the WPA slave narrative project from the 1930s, where government workers went out very specifically to recover the stories of former slaves, and you have the abolitionist movement publishing the autobiographies of slaves who had successfully made their escapes. So slaves we know more about actually than poor whites. I went through every single volume of the WPA slave narratives. It was about 3 shelf-fulls at the library, and looked for every single mention of anyone that the slaves would have referred to as po white. They recorded those narratives in the dialect, or po white trash. and I just looked to read whatever they had recalled about the poor whites themselves. And that really gave me a pretty good blueprint for the chapters that I eventually wrote.
What were they saying about them?
Again, it's this complicated mix that there was a mean, poor white overseer on the one hand, but then there are also those slaves who respond that there was a really sad poor white family that lived down the road from them, and there was seemingly some recognition of sympathy there. What I think most comes out in the slave narratives, though, is how the slaves were placing themselves in a broader scheme of humanity. Slaves were very shrewd observers of their world, and they were very much aware that all white people were not created equal. That yes, there are very wealthy masters out there, but there were also white people who didn't measure up, and they could spot who these people were. And you do find, especially when you get into slave folk songs and folk tales, you can recognize their understanding that they thought themselves at least as good, if not better, than this poor white category in Southern society. I thought about this topic for the first time in 1997. I was working on my master's thesis, and I ran across one very interesting slave runaway ad. It was in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, which at the time was a center of a very early attempt to mine gold. There was gold discoveries in North Carolina. And in this one particular slave runaway ad that I found in one of the local Charlotte area newspapers, they were looking for a slave that they had that the master suspected had run away with a low white man by the name of John Underwood. And the master who placed this ad believed that John Underwood and his runaway slave were working the gold mines of Mecklenburg County together in secret at night. And the ad says, we find out that John Underwood is a shoemaker, which would not have been a very prestigious occupation. We also find out that he was, and this is the words of the ad itself, that John Underwood was fond of lying in Negro kitchens. And as a young grad student at the time, I was very much taken by the content of this ad. And I realized that there wasn't really anything out there that addressed this kind of cooperation between a runaway slave and a poor white man. And that was what I decided to do for this book.
Why don't you think people talk about that kind of relationship so much?
The textbook industry is a tricky one because there's so much to cover that you really have to kind of go with where the major flow, where the major narrative runs. The kinds of cases that we're finding here, they're not entirely exceptional, but they're also complicated. And textbooks oftentimes head toward the lowest common denominator. And that's really how we wind up losing a lot of our history.